You're all extremely welcome, however virtually, to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre this, well, some parts of the world probably quite nice Tuesday evening. We're getting our good weather a little bit later in the week. But just to say, I'm so pleased with everything that's happened in these Tuesday talks, and we've had some extraordinary people, and tonight's no exception. And just to say, Marjorie Woollacott, I mean, it occurred to me today what word to use, and the word is team. Marjorie is a serious player in the team, and I don't feel we've had a team before. What I mean is lots of people have been interested in that interface between serious science and serious spirituality, let's call it that. Those two sides, both of which are very important, and one of which has had much, much more attention than the other. But a few people were doing that, and I was sort of hanging around on the outside looking through the bars, you know, and there were a few people in the park. Now I think we are a team. I mean, every time people come on, I mean, Eben Alexander said, you know, there's going to be a change in the last week, there's going to be a change in the paradigm shift in the next decade. And people like Marjorie are really making an effort. And I think it's coming together. And I think people's minds are changing. And just as, before I let her speak, you know, you may have seen on Netflix a thing called Surviving Death, 3 one-hour documentaries, serious stuff about survival of death and the evidence for it. And just recently, of course, Superhuman on Amazon Prime, showing right in front of you that paranormal things just do happen under scientific conditions run by serious scientists. So, you know, I don't want it to be a battle, but if it is a battle, we are slightly more on the winning side because we've got a terrific team. For example, Marjorie, who's now going to talk to us about something whose title I have forgotten, but I know generally what it is. Remind us, please.
Yes, it is Impossible Truths, Exploring Research at the Boundary Where Science and Mystical Experience Meet. And I want to say that I'm delighted to be here tonight, partly as I feel like I am representing the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, for which I am the current president and I was a founding member, and also being on the steering group of the Galileo Commission that is really trying to bring forward this understanding of a post-materialist world and an understanding of that world. So what I want to do, first of all, is just briefly share my screen so that you can see a little bit more about my background right now. What I've put on this screen for you is really something about the two hats that I wear. You'll see over here on the right a book called Motor Control, which is the textbook that is in its 5th edition that I have written that is for clinicians who are in rehabilitation medicine. Now that's the hat I wore most of my career, but then toward the end of my career, I began doing research on meditation. And then I wrote this book right at the end of my university appointment called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, as I began to do research on meditation and near-death experiences and other phenomena of that sort. And so just want to remind you that you're going to be hearing really from the two sides of me today in many different ways. So saying that, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that you can see me again. And what I want to do tonight is I want to start with a short meditation as a way of dipping into some of the topics I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm not sure that I can see all of you, but I'm hoping you'll raise the hand so others can see. How many of you have actually meditated before? I'm assuming that a fair number of you have. Yes, and then the question is, how many are regular meditators? How many people do it on a reasonably regular basis? Do we have a fair number of hands too? So here is what I am wanting us to do first is, I think the aim of meditation is simply to still what I call the default mode network or the mind wandering network of the brain. And that is the part of our brain that has this constant background narrative going on inside. And I think some people call it the crazy roommate that is always with us. And what I want us to be doing in meditation then as we practice it today is to bring the awareness to the present moment, to that pure awareness that's always there and lies just behind the verbal narrative going on in the mind. It's that place that's peaceful and still. So what I'd like you to do is to take a comfortable sitting posture with your feet flat on the floor, about hip-width apart and parallel, and simply rest your hands on your thighs or in your lap, and let your shoulders be wide. And now feel your sitting bones grounding down into the chair beneath you, and then your spine gently lengthening upward from the base of your spine all the way through the crown of your head. And now you can close your eyes and begin focusing on the breath. Take a deep breath in and a long breath out. And again, a deep breath in and a long breath out. And now let your breath come back to its natural rhythm and simply rest your awareness on the movement of the breath in the stillness of the present moment. And if thoughts come up, simply let them go and bring your mind back to the breath, resting in that inner stillness. And you can slowly begin to come out of meditation. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. This is fun to do at the beginning of a talk because there's a feeling then of everyone truly being present in this sort of still awareness. So thank you. So this gives you a bit of a taste of one of the topics that I'm going to be talking about today, which is meditation. And now what I'm going to do is introduce our topic for today, focusing on research on whether consciousness is fundamental. And I want to explore for a moment what the opposite view, the materialist view, proposes. So materialism holds that matter is the fundamental substance or the reality of nature. And thus all things, including the mind and consciousness, are secondary, and they're a product of those material interactions. Now, much of the data I present today seems like impossible truths from the perspective of materialist science, in which I was trained. Yet in a post-materialist world, in which consciousness is seen as fundamental and mystical experiences are accepted as valid, the data open us to new understandings, I believe, of the nature of reality. So in this talk, I'm going to be exploring lines of evidence from my own lab and also the research of others to support the hypothesis that consciousness is fundamental. And I realize that most of you have been studying mystical phenomena for many years, yet I hope I can bring to you more information about the significance of the neural correlates of those phenomena. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen again and move to our next slide. And what I want to do is give you a little bit about what we're going to be doing in this talk today. What I'm going to be doing is looking at these lines of evidence supporting the primacy of consciousness. And we're going to be starting out with meditation research as one of the spokes on this wheel, which is my hypothesis that consciousness is fundamental. We'll talk about meditation research first, then we're going to be moving to psilocybin research and talking about first-person experiences and also the data that talk about what happens in the brain during psilocybin research. We'll then move to near-death experience research, again, looking at both perspectives, first-person and then the scientific objective data. And then we'll be moving on to the placebo effect in energy healing research, two spokes, which to me are very important because they show the power of the mind to actually affect the physiology of the body. And we'll end with looking at the neurophysiological evidence to understand the primacy of consciousness. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we're going to be going. And I'll stop sharing now again for a moment, because I want to tell you now a little bit more of the background about my own self and tell you again how I got into this research. So here's some of my background. I am a neuroscientist, and I studied behavior during my whole career from what I call the third person or the scientific objective perspective. I've written about 200 papers in neuroscience related to brain development, to aging, and to neurologic disease. And I've received grants from the United States National Institutes of Health for 35 years for from $500,000 to $1 million per grant. And as you saw in that first slide, I've written a textbook for clinicians on assessing and treating patients that's now in the 5th edition. But most importantly, I was a scientific materialist when I started my research. And my scientific view was that our thoughts, our movements, and our awareness or our consciousness are solely a product of the neurons in our brain. Then, in 1976, I had an experience in meditation that opened up for me an awareness of a dimension of reality that I had never before experienced. I was invited by my sister to a meditation retreat led by an Indian meditation master, Swami Muktananda. Now, though I was skeptical, I was curious, and I decided to attend. The first morning of the retreat, it was announced that during the meditation session, the Swami was going to walk around the room and initiate every individual there. The initiation was described as a spiritual awakening, and it was to happen through the Swami's touch. Now, clearly, the scientist in me was skeptical. Since I was there, however, I decided to put my skepticism aside for the weekend. And besides, I was curious to see what would happen. When he reached me, I felt the Swami's thumb and fingers right between my eyes and on the bridge of my nose. I was alert. My eyes were closed, but my senses were otherwise fully engaged. So I had a sense of utter certainty about the event. It seemed as if a tiny lightning bolt leapt from his fingers to a point between my eyes and down to the center of my chest. I could feel the exact point where the energy stopped. It was my heart. The energy that came from my heart began to radiate outward, filling my whole being and beyond. It felt like nectar. It felt like pure love flowing through me. Words went through my mind, and they had nothing to do with scientific analysis. I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. Now, what was most astonishing for me was what happened afterwards. Without my effort or my even willingness, I made a 180-degree shift in my habits beginning the morning after I returned. I got up at 5 a.m. spontaneously and I meditated. It happened day after day, and in fact, it's never ceased. I did this knowing that just beneath the surface of my awareness simmered a quiet ecstasy. I tapped it once, and I had a sense that it was there waiting for me. There was also a shift in my worldview, and I had a professional dilemma. My question was, is my world Newtonian, or is my world energy-based? And I asked the question, what is consciousness? Is it tied to neural activity, or could consciousness exist without neurons? Now, even though I was meditating every morning, in my early years as a meditator, I considered myself first and foremost a scientist. It seemed like an almost impossible chasm existed between my life as a meditator and my life as a scientist. And this drove my husband, Paul, crazy. He loves meditation and he loves complementary medicine. And at social gatherings with my scientific friends, he would start to talk about Reiki or Tai Chi or some other energy medicine, only to get a horrified look from me as I quickly helped him change the subject. I was so afraid of losing my credibility with my scientific colleagues. After 25 years of leading those two lives, I felt a bit like I was leading like double lives. And it was a problem I decided to resolve by beginning to do research in my own laboratory on meditation and studying the nature of consciousness. Now, one of the things that spurred me to do this was hearing of the meditation experiences of another friend who was a scientist, David. And he had had experiences that were even harder for me to explain from my materialist worldview. And I want to tell you just about his experiences as well before we get into the research. He had gone to a meditation retreat while he was doing his postdoctoral training in developmental neurobiology. He said the concept of meditation had intrigued him, and he'd even tried it on his own for a while in college, but nothing had ever come of it. During the first day of the meditation retreat, he found himself in a deep meditation, something he had never experienced before. And for the first time in his life, he lost awareness of external sensations, and he became absorbed in an inner state of peace and calm. Later that evening, after the program had ended, he began to feel energy rising up inside of himself, subtle at first, and then stronger and stronger. He didn't know what it was or where it was coming from, but he did sense that something important was about to happen. That night, he was awakened from his sleep by an enormous jolt of energy shooting up his back from the base of his spine to the top of his head. And when it reached the top, this energy exploded with a loud bang and a brilliant flash of light. When he opened his eyes, he found out that his awareness had expanded beyond the confines of his physical body, and he was aware of looking down at the room and his body from the ceiling, just like people do in NDEs. The next day in the retreat, he learned that he had a classic experience of what he called Shaktipat Initiation, an Indian term that is about the awakening of the inner spiritual energy, the Kundalini, that Bruce Grayson calls the bioenergy that drives human evolution. He said that this experience of inner light, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen, continued to unfold for him until one day in meditation, it filled his entire body. He said he was consumed by an indescribable ecstasy, and waves of love flooded up inside of him. He said he no longer had any sense of individual existence. He felt as though he had entered the heart of God. And yet in that moment, he said that he felt more himself than he ever had before. So what does this tell us about the nature of consciousness from Deva's experience in meditation? I think it suggests that there is an energetic component that he experienced throughout his being. Remember, he talks about an enormous jolt of energy shooting up his back. And it suggests that his awareness went well beyond his body, that there was a sense of non-local awareness or unity consciousness. And this is not an ordinary perception caused by the usual activity of neurons in the brain. I'm sure he would agree with that as well. So the question that I want to ask now is, has research explored this type of spiritual awakening? And if so, what do the data say about experiences like this? So once again, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at a little bit of the data. So I have recently published an article in the journal Explore on research related to Kundalini awakenings. And I've done this with Yvonne Cason and Russell Park. And what we did, as you can see in the slide, is we looked at 342 participants that filled out a detailed questionnaire. And what we found is that 70% of the respondents said that they had experiences of feeling head or body expansion, with one person saying, "It was unusual in that my body dropped away. There was an expansion, a oneness with all of creation." So very similar to David's. Also, 51% had the experience of floating or being swept up. One person said, "I awoke from sleep into a fully conscious, intense out-of-body experience in which I returned to my body and left my body again under control approximately a minute later, and experienced floating through walls as I floated about my house." And now 67% of the respondents noted an increase in psychic abilities after their awakening. And 34%, like people with NDEs, found they had an increased tendency to cause electronic instruments to malfunction. So now I want to go over briefly with you what happens during meditation in terms of our own brain processes. So what I'm going to do now is go to our next slide. And I know that this looks a bit complex, but I will walk you through it carefully. So first of all, I want to say that when I first started my research on meditation, one of the first questions I wondered about, as you see on the slide, and you might wonder about it too, is what happens in your brain when you're meditating? Now, this wonderful slide by Professor Richie Davidson and his colleagues from the University of Wisconsin gives you a moment-by-moment view of the process and perhaps what you were experiencing in our first meditation that we had tonight. So in the scanner, like we did in our first meditation, the participants were training their attention on their breathing. Now, typically during this form of meditation, the mind wanders from an object, and the meditator has to recognize this and then restore their attention to the gradual rhythm of their breathing. Now, in this study, The meditator is in a brain scanner. So what they need to do is press a button in the scanner whenever their mind wanders and then bring their mind back to the breath. And so this is what happens. So typically in one of these experiments, you're focusing on your breathing. And then the first thing they're noticing in their study is the episode of mind wandering that you might have found was happening in your short meditation today. And in the mind wandering, I want you to see that there are actually specific parts of the brain that are activated. And these are called the various areas of the default mode or the mind wandering network of the brain. The most important ones are the medial prefrontal cortex, this blue area, and then this orange area, which is the posterior cingulate cortex. And then there are other parts of this default mode network as well. Now, this is a very important network because it is involved in building up our models of ourselves in the world, and we actually call it our egoic structure of our mind. It's the part of us that's always talking about me and mine versus you and yours and them. Okay, so the mind wandering is going on, and then you might have noticed yourself that all of a sudden you're aware that your mind has wandered, and now we're dealing with this salience network, which includes the anterior cingulate cortex and a few other areas of the brain. And this particular part of the brain says, oh, wait a minute, my mind is wandering. And that's when the people press the red button. And then another part of the network, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, disengages you from your mind wandering, brings you back to the breath. And then you have your sustained focus on the breathing with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this blue area, being the main area involved. So this cycle goes on throughout, say, a 45-minute meditation, always one after another after another. So what we might say to ourselves is, why is this important? Why are you telling me this? I'm now going to show you research indicating that this wide-ranging default mode or mind-wandering networks activity is significantly reduced in meditation as you increase the strength and the duration of your focus on the breath, for example. So what happens is the narrative goes away. The brain becomes quieter. And that's probably what happened to me in that first meditation experience I had. In that initiation experience, my mind became still. So now I'm going to tell you about a study that shows significant reductions in two primary modes of that default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. So this is a study that was done by Judson Brewer and his colleagues at the Yale University School of Medicine. Now, what I'm going to be showing you is in images from a brain scan that was done in meditators versus in control participants who hadn't meditated before, as they were asked to focus again on the breath. And what they did then is they looked at the activity in these two modes of the default mode network we just talked about. This is that medial prefrontal cortex that was in blue before, and this is the part of the posterior cingulate cortex that was in orange. So these two points are the default mode network activity, and the black areas are showing the reduction in the activity during meditation in the experienced meditators. And then if you look at the bottom of the slide, what you can see is that the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the C area of the slide, shows this significant reduction in activity in the meditators versus the controls, which showed no changes. And the same thing happened in this posterior cingulate cortex, the drop in the meditators in this activity of that part of the brain. So what it's really telling you is that the brain truly becomes quite still in meditation as that narrative part of the brain is silenced. And so the question that I ask is, could it be that the stilling of our narrative mind actually allows subtler perceptions to come through our awareness that are normally filtered out? That is, the perceptions that mystical experiences are made of. So now let's look at another one of those parts of our hub of our hypotheses we're looking at related to this fundamental nature of consciousness. We're going to look at Psilocybin research, and we're going to look at both a case study and research data from Barrett and Griffiths. So what I want to do now is, first of all, look at the first person perspective of what happens when people actually do ingestion of psilocybin. And this is part of a study at Johns Hopkins University by Barrett and Griffiths, where they were looking at the effect of a single dose of psilocybin on cancer patients, and if that helped them get rid of the anxiety of the fact that death would be coming to them. So this is what one individual in their study said. He said, in my mind's eye, I felt myself instinctively taking on the posture of prayer in my head. I bowed to this force. I was humbled and I was honored to be in this presence. It felt more real than any reality I have experienced. He said it was when I surrendered to this that I felt like I let go. Time and space did not exist there. There was only this feeling of unconditional and undying love. So this was one person's mystical experience of unconditional love beyond time and space. Now, what does the research say about the changes in brain activity that happened during that experience? So this figure I will walk you through, since it's a little complex, is basically going to show similar deactivations in this default mode network during meditation and psilocybin experiences. So this top part of the figure shows you that default mode network and the two main nodes. This is the medial prefrontal cortex in green now, and this is that posterior cingulate in red. And we're simply showing it in two different views of the brain from right and left. Now, what we're seeing in psilocybin, which is in this next part, is that if you compare it to this particular slice of the brain, looking at it from the same view, medial prefrontal cortex blue shows reduced activity in this particular part of the default mode network, and also in the posterior cingulate, this other blue area. So blue means reduced activity. And it's exactly the same as we saw in the previous slide for the meditators, which are down in the bottom part of the graph. Reduced activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, and then back in this posterior cingulate. So I think what's important here is we have very similar effects with psilocybin ingestion and meditation, reducing the activity in this default mode network of the brain. Now, what's also interesting to me is that this is directly correlated in these studies with the sense of unity consciousness or ego-dissolution that the person experiences in that state. So we're putting third and first-person perspectives together to show the validity of the data. So let's continue now to our next spoke of our wheel, examining the fundamental nature of consciousness. And actually, I just went on. What I want to talk about are two different questions that we're going to be looking at. The first is, can consciousness remain when the heart and the brain have stopped functioning? And are NDEs real, or as the skeptics say, are they hallucinations? And I believe that recent studies from both the first and the third person perspectives looking at NDE research suggest that they cannot be explained by a Newtonian worldview. So what I want to do next is tell you a case study of a person who was an MD, Bettina Payton, who had been an avowed materialist during her MD career until she had her near-death experience. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment again, just to tell you a little bit about that story. So she, again, as I said, was an avowed materialist until she had this near-death experience during the birth of her third child, which was delivered by cesarean section. Payton says she lost consciousness under anesthesia until she heard a voice. Her blood pressure is too low. She says, my anesthesiologist's alarmed voice had snapped me awake as if from a deep sleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the operation, I was wide awake. I was super aware and attentive in a way I'd never been before. She said, she heard him say, how's it going? The anesthesiology was asking the surgeon how far along he was in the delivery. He exclaimed that her blood pressure was plummeting fast. She says, in the next instant, a strange stillness spread inside my chest, a hollow feeling. My heart had stopped. At the same time, my vision opened, and I discovered that I could see into the room. How amazing, she said. The eyelids on my physical eyes had been taped shut to protect the corneas. Yet by some other mechanism, I could see perfectly clearly. Several units of blood were hanging from an IV pole directly over me when already being transfused. Then there was a volley of strident beeps. It was the cardiac monitor indicating her heart had stopped. And Payton watched the anesthesiologist slam his fist into a large red button on the wall. He was calling a code that was going to culminate in the arrival of the hospital resuscitation team. Now, there's more to the medical drama that was unfolding, but let's now look at another part of Bettina Payton's experience, her feeling that she was about to die. She says, "I see in my inner vision a vast darkness expanding behind me at the backmost boundary of my mind. My awareness reaches the edge of the precipice, and I let myself fall, gliding downward in a graceful backward arc into the unknown." She says, laced within the black darkness were particles of shimmering light. She sensed a pervasive presence in that light, an intelligence, a pulsating power. And she said she was deeply happy, enveloped in peace. She said all was perfect until her experience was interrupted by a statement, "You must live." And she says, funneling down through the darkness, her consciousness opened up into the confines of the hospital operating room. She said, "My surgeon was working in a surgical field filled with blood, performing what he would later call was his first 3-minute hysterectomy." She says, "My attention was then drawn to a white-haired gentleman in scrubs, a senior surgeon entering the room. He wove a path through the crowded room, coming to her right side. Without a word, the elderly surgeon reached deep into her blood-filled abdomen. He located the aorta, wrapped his fingers around it, clenched his fist, and clamped the aorta shut. Shortly after that, one of the nurses leaned over and whispered into Payton's ear that her baby had lived. She had a healthy daughter." When Payton later opened her eyes, she was in the critical care unit, lying in a bed, encircled by her husband and that team of doctors and nurses. She still had a tube in her trachea, so she couldn't talk, but she put up her hand to keep people from speaking, and she motioned to be given something to write with. Before anyone spoke, Payton had written on a napkin words to this effect: "I know I had a baby girl. I know my uterus is out. I know my heart stopped." After her NDE, once Payton awoke, she was utterly convinced that consciousness is primary. In her words, "When I woke up in that intensive care unit, I had vivid recall of everything that had happened. My perception was, as it still is, that I am not this body, this individual, and that consciousness is real and is the substratum of everything that exists." And I should mention that she actually went into hospice care after that experience in her career, and she wanted to help people that were on the edge of moving to the other side of the veil. And she said when she walked into the room, people could feel her lack of fear of death when she went to help others out because of that near-death experience. Now, what I want to do next is show you some of the data from, in fact, the scientific research now that we can see that has been done by a number of laboratories. And I'm going to shift now to the research by, first of all, Pim van Lommel. But I want to say that you've certainly heard him talk here on this particular series, but also Bruce Grayson and Sam Parnia and Peter Fennick have each done similar sorts of studies. There's a lot of research that supports this information that we're going to present today. What I want you to notice is that this was a prospective study, which is the gold standard of studies in this area. When we say prospective, we mean that at a particular set of 10 hospitals in the Netherlands, everyone that had cardiac arrest was brought into the study from a particular date and time until they had all of the data they needed collected. And what they found when they did this was that 12% of those people had a core NDE. And 1/4 of those people actually watched and recalled events during their cardiac arrest with no brain activity. And Pim van Lommel concludes at the end of this wonderful article from the Lancet Journal, again, ranked number 2 of all of the journals in medicine. He says this, he says, "The thus far assumed, but never proven concept that consciousness and memories are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death and flat EEG?" And now my next question is, what would we see happening in the default mode network of the brain during an NDE? Now, I want to remind you that we don't have brain scan data on near-death experiences because we can't put someone in the brain scan during cardiac arrest. But we know the default mode network is deactivated because the entire brain cortex is deactivated, and even the midbrain and the brainstem. And in the next slide, we have data from Pin van Lommel of what happens in the brain in its activity during an NDE. What we're looking at here is EEG from the cortex and ECG from the heart during cardiac arrest. And what you can see is the heart rhythm is going along normally until a particular point here in part B of this graph, and then the heart stops. Now you notice that then the brain activity continues on for a number of seconds until at about 20 to 30 seconds later, this activity stops too, and now the brain activity is flatlined, meaning now the person has no perception coming in from the senses anymore. The brain is not working. So to me, that really shows me that, in fact, in 3 cases that we've talked about so far, meditation, psilocybin, and near-death experiences, that default mode network is turned way down or it's turned off. And that's when we have these mystical experiences occurring. So what I want to do now is shift to the next spokes of our research wheel and discuss evidence for the primacy of consciousness from research on healing and on the placebo effect. And we're going to look at additional evidence to support the primacy of consciousness. So these studies show that in energy healing, as in meditation, psilocybin experiences, and in NDEs, people are accessing consciousness beyond the patient's brain. And we're going to start with the placebo effect. So in the next slide, what you can see is a quote that I really love. Skeptics of complementary medicine typically say improvements are only due to the placebo effect. But we ask, what is the placebo effect? Now here is a dictionary definition. A placebo, or its opposite, a nocebo, is an intervention that has no direct physiological consequences, but nevertheless improves or worsens a person's health. The term placebo, interestingly, originates from the 13th century, and it reflects the practice of engaging professional mourners for funerals. Such mourners were actually called placebos. It means to please, and it's a term used to describe inauthentic grief. Now later, medicine began using the term to describe treatments with no curative properties, but which made patients feel better. So it's that connection between the term placebo and inauthenticity that has come forward, and it's stigmatized the current day notion of the placebo effect. And here is the most prominent paradox of Western medicine. The effect of the placebo is acknowledged, even though within the framework of materialist science, it cannot be explained. The placebo effect demonstrates that simply believing, that is a mental condition, that a medication will improve your health is enough to bring that about. In other words, the physical condition. A classic case of the placebo effect actually took place in the 1950s. And I'm going to actually stop sharing again so I can tell you that story of a Mr. Wright who had lymphatic cancer. So according to his physician, Mr. Wright had huge tumor masses the size of oranges that were in his neck, in his axillae, in his groins, his chest, and his abdomen. They said his spleen and his liver were enormous, and between 1 and 2 liters of milky fluid had to be drawn from his chest every other day. Now, the doctor's impression was that he was in a terminal state, untreatable, other than giving him some sedatives to ease him on his way. Now, Wright asked his doctor to put him on a new drug called cribiazine, which he'd heard was effective against precisely the kind of tumors he had. Though Wright wasn't eligible to be part of that study, evaluating the drug because he basically had a life expectancy of about 2 weeks, he begged his doctor to be part of the study, and the doctor finally agreed. The doctor then says, injections were to be given 3 times weekly, and I remember he received his first one on a Friday. I didn't see him again until Monday, and I thought as I came to the hospital, he might be dead by that time. What a surprise was in store for me. I had left him feverish, gasping for air, completely bedridden. Now here he was walking around the ward. He was chatting happily with the nurses, and he was spreading his message of good cheer. Within 10 days, he was able to be discharged from his deathbed, practically all the signs of his disease having vanished. Apparently, cribaisin was a miracle drug. Unfortunately, that was not the case. And a few months later, Wright happened to read an article detailing the negative results in a medical study about cribaisin. And it showed that it had failed to cure cancer in all of the testing clinics. Shortly thereafter, Wright's tumors returned. The doctor who noted the placebo effect that seemed to be at work gave his patient what he told him was a new, super refined double strength product. And in fact, the doctor was injecting Wright with saline. So once again, Wright's tumors disappeared and he was symptom-free for 2 months. And once again, Mr. Wright encountered negative press on cribaisin. 2 months after the injection, he read a study in which the American Medical Association declared cribaisin to be worthless as a medication to fight cancerous tumors. Within a few days of reading the report, Mr. Wright was readmitted to the hospital. His faith was now gone, his last hope vanished, and he succumbed in less than 2 days. So that was a case study. What does the scientific research actually show us? So once again, I will share the slide and we will look. So we're going to discuss now research by Tor Wager and his colleagues at the University of Michigan, who performed functional magnetic resonance imaging brain scan experiments in which they gave participants either a placebo cream or an analgesic cream to counteract thermal pain. They found that those placebo manipulations decreased neural responses in the brain regions that were pain sensitive, including the thalamus, the insula, and the anterior cingulate cortex. And in addition, once again, the magnitude of the neural decreases correlated with the reduction in the reported pain. They concluded that this strongly refutes the conjecture that placebo responses simply reflect report bias, which is what most skeptics say. So the belief that you're receiving a pain medication has a similar effect to the medication in many patients. Now, even patients with serious movement disorders like Parkinson's disease have responded to placebos. In one study of Parkinson's patients, the authors found that a placebo injection resulted in an increase in the release of endogenous dopamine that was comparable to the effect of L-Dopa, which is the drug usually prescribed for Parkinson's. And I'm a motor control neuroscientist, and I have done quite a bit of research on Parkinson's and motor control, and I was amazed to find out that even here, the placebo effect is in place. Not only did those Parkinson's patients' mind belief systems increase the release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter whose function is drastically reduced in Parkinson's, they also improved their motor skills. That's a powerful and a specific effect of the mind on the body. So placebos do have a significant effect on our physiology, though it's through our consciousness or our mind. So now we've looked at the power of our patient's belief in a placebo. There are many other factors that could contribute. The power of the doctor's warmth and support, and the power of the doctor's belief in the procedure, to name just a few. Now, we're going to ask next, I think, a very important question for healthcare. Does the doctor's own belief, that is his or her own consciousness, also influence the placebo effect? I'm especially interested in the power of the doctor's expectations to influence the outcome of experiments related to placebos and pain medication. So we're going to look now, and I'll walk you through this particular slide. So we are going to be looking now at a double-blind experiment when neither the physician nor the patient knows which therapy is being administered. And in this study of post-operative dental pain by Grace Lee and his colleagues, that was published in The Lancet, he is now looking at research from a group from the National Institutes of Health of the United States. And what he's doing is he's looking at patients in each of 2 groups that were told they would be given a drug that would, one, either increase their pain because it was a narcotic antagonist, it would decrease their pain if they got the second drug. That would be a narcotic analgesic to reduce the pain, or they would be given a placebo, which would have no effect. It was a saline placebo. Now, interestingly, the doctors were told additionally that there were only two patient groups. Number one would receive the placebo or the narcotic antagonist, and thus that group would have no chance of pain reduction, placebo and our narcotic antagonist. And the second group would receive all three. So they did have a chance of pain reduction because they were getting the analgesic. So the question is, what did we see? What you can see in this figure is that we're looking at the pain level, and the highest levels are going up on the y-axis. And we're looking at the change in pain across minutes after the treatment. And you're looking at the placebo group, but two different placebo groups. The one where the doctors thought there was no chance of pain reduction. And in that case, you notice the pain went way up. Now, in the one where the doctors thought there was a chance of pain reduction, in that placebo group, it was down. So to me, this is fascinating. In other words, altering the doctor's belief can change the outcome of the patient's well-being, which in this case was measured by pain relief. This is actually a significant point since it suggests that the power of the caregiver's belief can influence the patient's health without the patient even knowing what the caregiver's belief is. So I think a powerful study. So now I want to move on to looking at evidence related to energy healing itself. And one question we might ask about energy healing is, how does the intention of the healer affect the patient's body physiologically? And we're going to be turning now to the study by Jean Achterberg and colleagues, published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. She is a pioneer researcher in mind-body medicine. And I want to do it because it tells us something about possible brain regions involved in distant intentionality of energy healing. So Achterberg performed a controlled experiment to determine the extent to which one could, in a laboratory setting, measure the effects of a healer's distant intention upon a receiver's brain processes. So she chose to study 11 practitioners from different healing modalities who had practiced healing for about 2 decades. And in this study, the healer was in a magnetically shielded room, the control room, and the receiver was in a separate room lying in an fMRI brain scanner so we could see what was happening in their brain. The healers were instructed to start and stop their distant intention healing at random points in time unknown to anybody in advance except the experimenter. Now, when asked to send this intention, the healers were told to connect with the receiver in whatever way was customary in their own healing practice. And the receivers were asked to relax as much as they could in that scanner environment. Now, the study outcome revealed that the healer's intention was, in fact, registered by the functional magnetic resonance scanner as changes in the receiver's brain activity during those transmission periods as compared to those arrest or control periods. And that's what you're seeing here in the slide. So once again, we're seeing that there were 2 areas that were very important in this change. And one was the frontal superior cortex here in the brain, and also the anterior cingulate cortex. So we show that there are actual changes in the recipient's brain during those moments of healing where that transmission is being made by the healers. So now I want to turn to ask the question, what do we know about changes in other physiological and psychological variables related to energy healing like Reiki? And we'll turn to our next slide. So now I'm going to look at work by a research group that was led by Rachel Friedman and her colleagues from Yale University, again, one of our primary top US medical schools. And what she did here is she did a randomized controlled trial in which she looked at 37 cardiac patients who had had a heart attack in the previous 72 hours. Again, a gold standard type of research with this randomized controlled clinical trial, and her groups were the Reiki Energy Healing Group, number 1, and then 2 control groups, one that had relaxing music and the other that simply had bed rest. And she found that the group with the Reiki healing sessions improved their heart function as indicated by their heart rate variability, while the two other groups didn't. And what I find most interesting is they found that it had the same effect as the pharmaceutical propranolol in improving heart function. So once again, instead of giving them the pharmaceutical, you can give them Reiki and not have the side effects of the pharmaceutical drug. So now, having looked at this research evidence, I want to show you a model of consciousness that supports the evidence we've been reviewing today. So we are going to first look at this slide, at the left-hand side of the slide, looking at this materialist, or what I call Newtonian model of the origin of consciousness. And what you're seeing here is I have a person's brain and two red arrows going up to what I'm calling the mind here in this blue crescent, or their local consciousness, saying that the brain is the sole producer of our mental activity or our consciousness. But you notice there's a big red question mark here on the left because no scientist knows how the brain could actually produce our conscious activity. Now, what I want to do is look now at our second model, which I would call our mind-brain continuum model, which shows now that the brain can produce consciousness, but also our mind can affect our brain activity. So the interaction works both ways. And the important thing about this model is that this could actually explain our placebo effect. For example, the fact that our mind's understanding of whether we're actually getting a placebo or a pain medication can actually influence what happens to our body physiologically and to our brain itself. And I then want to turn to the final one, which I believe is the best model, called the energy matter continuum model. And in this model, what we're saying is that there is now access to non-local consciousness. And there is a two-way interaction between non-local consciousness and our local consciousness of our mind, which can also affect our brain. And again, it works both ways. This particular model explains near-death experiences, it explains cosmic consciousness experiences in meditation, and also energy healing research, where a different person is actually affecting your own mind and your physiology. So what I want to do now is show you one more set of models. Now, this is showing, first of all, on the left, our typical brain activity during normal waking awareness. So what I believe is happening during normal waking awareness is that we basically have a filter in our brain, in fact, multiple filters in our brain. And I've been talking today about this default mode network that I show here on the left. And that default mode network acts as a strong filter that keeps us from experiencing non-local consciousness. And therefore, we are basically listening only to our egoic narrative mind, and that's interacting with our brain. But when in an NDE or in meditation or psilocybin experiences, what we find happening is that we turn off or we turn way down our default mode network, then the non-local consciousness comes through, and that large green arrow is showing that because our filter is almost removed. And now we have very little egoic narrative mind actually talking to us. And now we experience beautiful psi phenomena and mystical experiences as well. So what I think is really important then is to realize that our filter is reduced or removed in this case. And one thing that I, in fact, was talking with Lance about ahead of time is I'm only mentioning the default mode network today, but in fact, there are many filters on the brain that we want to consider. And Ian McGilchrist has talked about one of the filters, which is, for example, our left brain filter going to the right side of our body. And that is another filter that gets in our way of experiencing a wider consciousness. And we can talk about that perhaps during the Q&A. So next we might simply ask, what have we learned about consciousness through examining meditation, near-death experiences, psilocybin studies, placebos, and energy healing? And I think that research in each of these areas, from both the first-person experiences and from our laboratory studies, have given us evidence to support that hypothesis of the fundamental nature of consciousness, that consciousness exists beyond the brain. I think experiences of meditative awakening and NDEs appear to open a doorway to this higher awareness through the stilling of our brain activity in that default or mind-wandering network and perhaps other networks of the brain that is our basics of our egoic identity. So in conclusion, we might ask, what do we mean by the term consciousness existing beyond brain activity? And for me, I think it means embracing consciousness as a fundamental aspect of the universe, with the material world truly being secondary. And by nourishing our ability to access that wider consciousness, we can begin to let go of a very limited view of our true nature as human beings. And through accessing that wider awareness, we can begin to improve our own well-being, our healthcare systems in our countries, and our respect for all living beings and our planet. So I want to end with one last slide, basically saying to you that a number of us, both scientists and lay people, people in all professions, have an interest in extending research on the question of the primacy of consciousness. And we started a new academy, which I may have mentioned earlier. It's the Academy for the Advancement of the Post-Materialist Sciences, the AAPS. And in it, what we're trying to do is not to oppose the current scientific worldview related to understanding the nature of consciousness, but we're just trying to expand it a little so that we can include data from studies like these on NDEs, meditation, and other mystical phenomena, which suggest that consciousness is fundamental. And our goal in the AAPS is to encourage students and young researchers to continue this exploration so that we may move forward. And I also want to remind you, as you see, that my book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, is the place from which much of the research that I talked about today was actually taken. And you can go to there and go into a lot of those studies in more depth. So I want to thank you very much, and of course, open it up to questions, and I hand it back to Lance. And I will stop sharing. There we go. Oh, and you're on mute, Matt. Yeah.
God, yes, I have to say that my wife came in and told me to mute myself. It happens quite often in my life. No, I'm joking. Okay, Marjorie, that was absolutely marvelous. I mean, you have covered a lot of ground, and luckily, in the space of time, you've managed to get in 6 major areas of research. You know better than I do that there are lots of other things which support exactly this same thesis. I mean, you haven't mentioned telepathy, you haven't mentioned remote viewing, you haven't mentioned many of the things which appear in those films that I talked about earlier. And there are all kinds of things that go on. But before we get into the questions which are in the chat, which I will come to in just a moment, I want to ask this. Probably those people on this Zoom call who are not very much aware of your work or of you don't realize that you're also, what was the old-fashioned expression, a scholar of Eastern law, that you have a great interest in Eastern religion, Eastern languages, even, you know, Buddhist scriptures and that kind of thing. And I mean, obviously, you did mention the guru who brought your awakening in what appears to be almost like a kind of fictional way, but I mean, it really happened to you. He was from the East originally, one assumes. But I mean, how important has that been in your journey through all this amazing stuff?
You know, I think like almost everybody that has had some sort of a meditative awakening, that particular moment is the crux of their whole change in their worldview. And I remember just talking to somebody who was doing a documentary on Federico Fagin. I'm not sure how many people know him, but he wrote this wonderful book, Silicon, where he talks about the same thing happening to him in the middle of the night when he's on a vacation in Tahoe with his family. And he said, literally, it turned his worldview from materialist, like my original one myself, 180 degrees to understanding that consciousness is fundamental. Now, I think because each one of our experiences may come from a slightly different trigger, a slightly different circumstance that might influence exactly how we go into depth in exploring it further. But I think they're all, of course, aiming at exactly that same viewpoint of this incredible, infinite feeling of love and light that seems to pervade our entire universe, but which our filters of our brain actually filter out. And there are as many techniques probably as the 360 degrees around a circle that will aim us back there. But I found that because that was my first experience through some Indian traditions, what I found is that when I went back to some of their original texts, and I'm talking about texts from like 1,000 years ago, that are part of the Indian Tantra studies from Kashmir, I found they sounded very, very much like modern studies and theories about the origin of consciousness. So I simply had to laugh that all of these countries of the world seem to have known about it 1,000 or more years ago, 2,000 years ago, when you read some of the Greeks as well. And yet the materialists always seem to be sort of on the upper hand of keeping us from like really living that throughout our culture. And I simply laugh about that because I was one of those people until I had that experience.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course. I mean, Jeffrey Kripal's book, The Flip, I mean, the very title gives you that moment of flip which perhaps everybody has, or anybody who makes significant progress in this area seems to have. Well, listen, Scott, could I ask you to unmute Bob Steck, please, Robert Steck? Meanwhile, I'm just going to ask Maureen Smith's question, if she would allow that. She asked quite a complex question. Who is it that knows what bits of the brain need to be changed when taking a placebo painkiller? I.e., those bits are not within my conscious knowledge, so who knows which of my bits you're trying to change with your placebo?
Exactly. And I think that's why the skeptics would have a hard time dealing with that, because in fact, I didn't mention that in placebo studies, they show, and hypnosis studies, by the way, because hypnosis does exactly the same thing as a placebo does, that basically each individual in effect chooses the parts of the brain that are going to be turned down in terms of pain relief, for example, meaning not consciously at all, but it's like one person will show mainly changes, for example, in the somatosensory cortex. They're really reducing the sensory information coming in from the pain receptors I'm gathering. And another person does it in another part of the brain, sort of further down the line. And to me, that is a fantastic notion. They are each affecting the brain, but their non-local consciousness is doing it in slightly different ways depending on the individual. Who can understand how that is going on, except that we do have what I would say our intellect is not doing it, but we have access to this wider consciousness that is very, very wise when we get the intellect out of the way.
Yes. So the idea of sort of who chooses or who's doing it or who's knowing is not relevant in some way here. We're operating at a different level of understanding, which is not the kind of understanding which we usually call understanding.
Yeah, well, and I want to mention one thing about that, Lance, and that is that I had this experience myself in a different situation. So I was at a workshop with Dean Radin. I think probably most of you know Dean Radin, and he said he decided to make it interactive at one point, and he had us see if we could do any precognition. And I don't do precognition. I mean, I think I'm so what we would call left-brained that I tend to be really in my intellect. But so he had us like imagining what would be coming up on the next PowerPoint slide. And they were images of various sorts. And when I was first just trying to like imagine an image, I had a terrible time doing it and I was always wrong. And then I said, wait, I'm gonna try something else. I'm simply gonna let my hand draw on the pad of paper what my hand wants to draw. And I'm not going to let my intellect even think about it. And then I became right 3/4 of the time when I let it go from some non-local consciousness into my hand and let my intellect get out of the way. And I just laughed at myself. It's like so much for my intellect. I know it's good, but there are times it's not so good.
That's a great story, and that's extremely convincing. I mean, these things. I have so much more to say about that. So could we have Bob Steck then, if he's there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I just saw that there was a very good relationship between your last model and what is called, distributed computing model, in which there are local processors that are mostly concerned with doing local tasks, but because of the programming and the connections, they are connected to a much larger, usually more powerful computer, which has connections to many other local processors. So, it seems like there's a network idea that maps very well to the brain-mind network that we've been talking about as well.
Yes, I like that. And I think there are two interesting aspects to what you just said. One is that when we really think about Indra's web is one way that people have talked about it for years, about this network of consciousness that we all can be connected to that is non-local, as you're saying, and perhaps infinite. And I think what I also like about it is that when I was reading Silicon, the book by Federico Fagin, he was saying that, in fact, he believed that computers would eventually be conscious one day, like all the other computer programmers in Silicon Valley, until he really gave it very, very deep thought and tried to, in fact, imagine creating one. And he realized he couldn't. He came up against that wall. And that was when, in fact, he began to look at how consciousness really was fundamental. So I love the computer analogy, and I love the fact that Federico says it's never going to happen with computers. So yay.
I do have one other unrelated question, and that is, I just saw recently in my feed about the research at MIT in which they were looking at anesthesia, propofol, I think it was, and showing that it seems to be synchronized, very slow wave activity in 4 or 5 regions of the brain that they were monitoring. And that's very interesting, but also brings up the question, a lot of this research, that you've talked about in other areas, doesn't seem to get into some of the research from anesthesiology. Even though Penrose and Hammeroff, have this, theory, but I hardly ever hear of research from anesthesiologists being referenced. You have a comment on that?
Well, and I do, and I think it's interesting that I don't know many anesthesiologists who are post-materialists. Most of the ones that I know are materialists that are fighting against the argument. I know there are people, like you just named Hammeroff, et cetera. And so I guess maybe what we need is a few more anesthesiologists that are MDs that actually write up the stories of their patients under anesthesia who don't have cardiac arrest, but still have these phenomena. Because I know that when you hear different MDs talking about near-death experiences, and I'm thinking of Lauren Belge, for example, is one of them that's written up a very nice book on the NDEs that happened in her hospital. She makes points about a number of them that were simply under anesthesia, and they were wide awake, and they were watching the operation from above and telling everything that had happened. And of course, the MD typically said, no, that was impossible. And I think in one case, in fact, it happened to a particular patient of hers earlier on in his life, that he actually watched the operation on his knee, and it was excruciating for him to watch it. He didn't want to be seeing it, and he would go through another operation again because he thought that that was normal when you were under anesthesia.
I think I remember roughly 10% of people under anesthesia have some memory of what happened under anesthesia.
Wow. See, to me, that would be great. And so I totally agree that it's hard. I, as a non-MD, have a hard time getting into that field to actually get that sort of research done, but we simply need somebody who is either related to anesthesiologists or one themselves to start collecting those data. I think it would be wonderful to do a prospective study. I would love it. So,
well, that's a great suggestion. Thank you very much indeed. Scott, could you unmute Peter Bruin? I'm just going to, while you do that, I'm just going to ask Marjorie Teresa's question. Marjorie has a mutual friend with you in someone called Marie Cheheri or something like that.
Yes.
Anyway, she wants to hear about the other brain filters you alluded to. I'm not sure that you were very specific about, well, you were, but anyway, you just said filters and you said there were many of them. What sort of things are we talking about?
Right, and I should say I'm working on a paper right now that really talks about all those filters and how they are contributing at the brain level anyway to our inability to experience this wider consciousness. So the second one that I just mentioned briefly was the one that Ian McGilchrist talks about so much, which is our left versus our right brain processing. And I think the point that I want to make there is what he is saying happens is that when your left brain begins to become dominant, as it happens in most of us that are scientists and in most of us in our modern culture, what seems to happen is that basically you start preferring to look at what you've already seen before, what's normal and familiar to you, and you are also wanting to break things down into little compartments, like creating the parts of a machine, for example. And what you're ruling out, which is mainly what the right brain is doing, is looking at a wider worldview that takes into account everything at once and is really interested in anything that's novel in the environment. And so you begin to see how that's a big filter right there. And we need to then work our way back to being a little bit more right brain dominant, or at least equal in the way the two halves of the brain work together for us. So that was one of them. And the other one I realized that we sometimes don't even think about is that every single sense that we have of the 5 senses is basically canalizing, putting into canals or channels the various vibratory frequencies from the universe that are coming in. So our vision just looks at a few frequencies of what we call the visual spectrum that our retina is taking in. We have our hearing doing vibratory frequencies that are even lower. And we have, of course, infrared heating and the other skin receptors. But basically, they are already just in those senses taking in only the tiniest trickle, I think, as maybe it was Aldous Huxley said, of the information that's available. So between those, between left brain, right brain, between the default mode network, oh, and one other one is the Thalamocortical Loop. So our thalamus is in our midbrain, a basic processor that goes between our senses and our higher cortex. And there is this loop that goes between our cortex, which is, again, our default mode network, our narrative brain thinking, to our thalamus, constantly reverberating. So those are all the thoughts going on in your mind, reverberating down through the thalamus and up again. And that dominates in many, many people, because it's so active, the sensory input coming in from the periphery, from our eyes and our ears. So that in fact, you know those moments you're walking along a path, I am in the woods, and I'm not seeing anything around me because my narrative is basically taking up all of my brain space. And then I suddenly wake up again to where I am on the path. And it's like, I don't remember the path for the last 15, 20 seconds. So there are 3 of the networks, and I know there are probably many more now that we begin to think about what are these filters that are actually changing the way we perceive the universe.
I think that's great. Thank you. Peter, can I ask you just for a moment to wait, because there's an almost identical question from Pauline Morgan. I'll just do her and we'll come to you, Peter. Do you have any thoughts around why our brains might be so full of filters that prevent us from living better lives and having a better relationship with our environment? What could be the evolutionary benefits of that? Or has the left hemisphere just gone rogue?
Well, so, I mean, it's interesting. I think that, first of all, when you read any of the people that talk about the filters, they say that if we had no filters on our brain, we would actually not be able to function in the physical world, that there would be way too much information to process. Yeah. And I want to add something that, in fact, I highly recommend a particular near-death experience video by a woman named, from Germany actually, Anke Everts, E-V-A-R-T-S, I think is how you spell her name, that you can find on YouTube, where she says after her near-death experience, where she was in a coma for 10 days, 9 or 10 days after a serious burn accident where her whole body was on fire. She said when she came back, the filters weren't there. And she said it was almost impossible for her to function. So here were the filters that weren't there. She could hear what her husband was thinking when he wasn't even talking. She could hear what her son was thinking before he spoke it. And she said also, she was asked to lie on this pillow that was full of goose feathers. And she said she could feel the experience of the geese when the feathers were plucked from them and the pain they had. And she could experience when she was also like wearing different clothes, all the process of making the clothes and the transportation that was used to get it to her. And she said it was agony for her to experience all of this. And she said it took her a while to turn those filters back on. And she said she still likes to stay in the present moment as much as possible, but she said it's very interesting that there are times, even now, she says she can be in her body in the present moment and at the same time witnessing what is going on from above her body, and she can move back and forth. So it has its good points, and it also has its bad points if we don't know how to modulate those filters.
That's fascinating. That's incredible. Listen, after Peter Bruin, or while he's talking, Scott, could you unmute Nick Kyle, please? So, Peter, thank you for being patient.
Marjorie, thank you for a fantastic talk, a really fantastic talk. This whole series has forced us to concentrate on the notion of non-local consciousness, and as an extension of that, how that relates to the personal. Do the personal and the cosmic coexist, or are they parts of each other? Or and it's pushing me towards trying to formulate an almost impossible question, which is that, are there any authoritative theories about preconception consciousness? Because if post-mortem consciousness is both personal and cosmic, do we exist in the cosmic consciousness before we are born? I know, I'm sorry, I apologize for the question, but you know.
I think it's I ask that question of myself all the time. And I mean, what I am aware of is that, of course, I've read Julia Moss-Bridges and Iman Sparus's book where they go into time and how that might be. And that's a great one published by the American Psychological Association, the APA. But here is one thing that a lot of people say, which I'm sure you're aware of too, and that is that when people are in this place of an NDE, for example, and it may be with psilocybin and these mystical experiences of meditation, literally they have gone beyond time and space when they've gone into this non-local experience. And so time and space don't exist. And in fact, this woman, Anka Everts, I believe you may pronounce it, said that that was her experience on the other side, that literally it was as if everything were happening at once. I mean, and she said like there were parallel universes, but not parallel universes like we think of the scientists talking about them, but just the fact that there were all these things that were going on at once that she could like tune into if she wanted to. Now, the theory of it, I have no idea, but it's because we who are stuck in this three-dimensional reality, I think can't imagine a place beyond the 3 dimensions where time and space don't exist. I mean, it boggles my own ability even to think about it. And yet, just with my own experience of precognition, just to get my intellect out of the way, allowed it to happen through my hands. I don't know how. So it's there. We have access to it, but how on earth we have access to it, because we still feel like we're in time and space. It's not like we feel like we went beyond it. I have no idea. So wonderful.
I make an observation about the anesthetists. I mean, it seems to me if they actually admit to what's going on, they might be personally and legally in jeopardy. So maybe that's why it's not happening.
That sounds like a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. Nick Kyle, is it there now?
Apologies for my ignorance, Marjorie, but my understanding of placebo has changed in the last few weeks. I always used to think that placebo was where parents thought they were getting the medicine, but weren't. But in recent weeks, I've learned that even patients who know they're not getting the medicine can have a similar effect. And in double-blind experiments, the factor of positive attention from the doctors as an explanation is eliminated. And I wanted to know initially what your thoughts were about the fact that our understanding of placebo might in itself need to be enlarged. But I have a second part to the question. I always feel that studies of near-death experience and even out-of-body experiences, they suffer from an over-attention to the brain as being the only intelligent processing part. And yet I've read studies where they say there are brain type cells capable of intelligent processing in the heart, in the stomach, and I've heard of stories where people can see through their skin enough to read print on a page. Do we need to think about our whole concept of intelligence actually being located in the body rather than the brain, which takes away a little bit of the need to create another parallel universe? And finally, even our concept of death. In the local hospital where I live in Scotland, and I don't think anyone here will know of this case because it's still sub judice, a woman was declared dead, pronounced by 2 doctors, but woke up 48 hours later after spending 2 nights in the freezer when she was getting her makeup done before being put in the coffin. Now, if that is happening in my area, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of cases where people have died for days and woken up. In other words, our concept of death is wrong. Any comments?
Yeah, so you have 3 of them. So I'll start out with the first one on the placebo. And I think that's actually very true that a number of studies have been done where you can just tell the person, here's a placebo pill, but it's a red pill. I mean, they go ahead and give them a pill. And somehow, even though they've heard it's a placebo, it still can have the same effect, which is interesting because, again, I think the point that we're making is that it is our mind. And I even wonder when we're saying our mind, it doesn't sound like my rational linear mind because I was just told it was a placebo, but it doesn't seem to matter because my subconscious mind sees the pill and seems to be very happy to go ahead and then have it reduce my pain. I mean, I think maybe what you're raising for me right now is that we think that our conscious rational intellect is the most important part of our brain, but I think Ian McGilchrist and others have said that, it's just the tip of the iceberg of who we really are. And there's a lot else going on that we're not aware of. So that's one thing. The second one was about, remind me again. The body, the heart, yes. Yes, so the neurons in the heart and the gut, yes. And definitely, I think, again, Dean Radin has done some very interesting studies about gut reactions and actually showing that you can have when he talks about, he says gut feelings are real, that there are neurons in your gut, and he has a paper that's published that I could send to Lance if anybody wants to see that paper, that shows the evidence for basically psi phenomena related to your gut neurons, where he's recording from the gut. Saying that, I would say that in fact, consciousness does exist throughout our body. And I think the mistake that we neuroscientists have, it's the hubris of the neuroscientist that thinks that only the brain neurons are important, but also only the neurons are important. Because in fact, what we hear from people that talk about the nature of consciousness is that all the cells in our body have an element of consciousness in them, and they're working together as a team to actually make the body function normally. And I like to remind myself of that and thank all that, my heart, my circulatory system, my bones, my muscles, et cetera, that they're all doing their job. And even though they aren't doing quite the same communication network as maybe my brain neurons are, they're very, very important at some level that I would call perhaps a lower conscious level in the way they interact together within the organs and the whole body. So yes, so all of that is true. And then finally, your last one was related to
definition of death needs to be
yes,
changed.
yes, and yes. So I think that you're right that in fact, as you said, there are many, many cases that have validated that. And I think that Pim van Lommel and others quote one from the Roman times when the person has the NDE. He's getting ready. I think they're getting ready for the funeral pyre, and he wakes up and 3 or 4 days after he was supposedly dead and tells about his NDE. And I know that there are other people that have woken up in morgues or similar situations like that. What you're reminding me about is the fact that Richie Davidson, I'm not sure how many people know about his work on meditation. He is, in effect, a researcher that, I quoted at the beginning of my talk, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, that's actually working with the Dalai Lama. And for many, many of the years of his research, he only talked about meditation in the way that we talk about mental training. It just makes our attention better. But now he's beginning to come out about the fact that he's working with the Dalai Lama on looking at lamas that have died and have kept their bodies in effect. What is the word I want to use? I mean, active. I mean, the body is still warm, and they're, I guess, it sounded like they were perhaps doing experiments where they were recording from the body during these, 10 days after the body is dead. Now, that's my remembrance of hearing this particular interview, but I guess I agree with you that I think it's a very important phenomenon that we should really look into. What is death? When does one actually separate the consciousness from the body? And when does the body then become what some would say just, the clay or something that's going to go to ashes? And when is that true separation? And I think it's a fascinating question we should spend some money looking into.
We have, thanks very much. We have a little more time. We have a message from Arthur Conan Doyle, or at least from his representative on Earth, who I think is Scott. Would you like to ask your question, Scott?
Excellent. Thanks, Marjorie. I just had a question. I don't know how much you know about Elon Musk's proposed Neuralink system, where he's going to be putting some sort of device in your brain which would allow you to interface with technology. Mm-hmm. And he says that he is looking for the answer about the nature of consciousness. I was just wondering what you think that might reveal about the nature of consciousness if it's successful.
To me, I think he's going down the wrong alley if he's interested in consciousness. I think that it's certainly possible that you could allow someone through brain activity to interact maybe with, some computer or something elsewhere if you have some sort of transmission gadget. But to me, that's a different question entirely than the nature of consciousness. And I think it gets back to Federico Fagin's point that computers themselves aren't going to be able to tell us anything more about consciousness. We're never going to make one conscious as far as he's concerned. And I guess the question is, I know that already people are doing experiments with, for example, quadriplegics, where they can get the quadriplegic through installing various transmitters from their nervous system into some gadget that will control their arm or their leg. They can get them to move their legs. So yes, we can get our neurons to activate electronic equipment or other equipment to make things move. But to me, that's very, very different than truly understanding consciousness. I would say he's learning maybe more about the neural correlates of how we can interface with the environment, but it's not quite the same as far as I can tell.
That's great. We are covering some fantastic ground here. Can we just end with what is perhaps a bit controversial subject of organ donation? I mean, if your Buddhist monk had started donating his organs or having them removed from him, and if he was in China, which he is, that happens a lot over there. That's why they execute so many prisoners so they can harvest their organs. If organ donation is something we're going towards, and I think in Scotland it's now default, to use your word of tonight, it's a default that unless you say you don't want to donate, you have to. Well, what about that? I mean, if death is delayed and if consciousness, perhaps it doesn't matter if we're going up to the higher consciousness anyway. But I wouldn't like to come back to discover that someone had my liver,
Well, so, I mean, I think there are two interesting points about that. I think it is an important point about, so when does death occur if you're going to do an organ donation? And as we said, that's a big question that we need to explore more fully. But I think to me, the other part that's really interesting is that there are two papers I know of, and probably more, about research that's been done on the person that has received the organ donation and how their personality changes from receiving. And that is both, I think, from heart transplants and maybe liver transplants, I'm not sure, different ones. And to me, I find that fascinating that, again, from the materialist perspective, they're trying to say, well, maybe our memories also lie in all the individual cells of our heart, but maybe it's literally that person then, their consciousness, a little bit of the consciousness stayed on this side and is now interacting with the person who has the new heart. They talk about, their personalities changing, their various habits changing and interests changing. And to me, that is fascinating. And again, says something about, well, then what does that mean about the heart of the person? Did the person really die or did they not die? Because clearly their spirit is now co-inhabiting that body, just a little bit anyway, with the person that's in it. So fascinating.
And then you get to reincarnation, which I'm sure is a mixture of various people, since nobody reincarnates completely. I mean, there wasn't a Jane Smith who is now completely Marjorie Woollacott. I mean, if there's a bit of one, So maybe it's all a bit more mixed up there. Listen, there's some, we're getting to the point in the chat where people are discussing whether you would wish to receive a brain transplant from a Rangers supporter. You will understand that in Scotland there are various passions aroused by football, which we are not going to go into. So I think I'll just focus on the fact that several people are saying how wonderful a talk that was, which I absolutely do agree. And can I say to people that they've had slightly better value for their money than usual, because like me, Marjorie talks quickly, but very clearly, unlike me. So that's fantastically good. Thank you for value for money. And shall we all just say thank you much in the usual silent way? It's rather embarrassing, really, isn't it, as we all clap. But thank you very much, Marjorie. We hope we will see you in Edinburgh one day when we're all allowed to. It'd be wonderful to have a workshop here. Can I just say that, first of all, let me draw your attention again to Marjorie's great book, Infinite Awareness from 2015. Can I say that the marvelous new researcher, young, which is what we want, Jessica Cornet from the SMN is coming to talk to us next week, and she'll be terrific, I think. And can I thank everybody for coming and sort of say, see you next week. And you can now creep away while I say thank you again to Marjorie privately. Okay, well, perhaps I'm going to leave. Perhaps that's what I have to do. I don't know. Marjorie, thank you very much indeed. We'll be in touch. I'm going to go away.